Hello folks, I would like to continue my discussion that I've had many a year ago on the AIDS virus. In the latest update from 2003 to 2012, the HSV rate in Africa went down from roughly 2/3 of the population down to under a third. Since that occurred, the new infections in Swaziland, which is the most affected country in Africa, which is the worst area in the world, infection rates actually declined from 2010, which is just shortly before the end of that survey, to 2016 by 43%. Now, back in 2015, when I made my last video on AIDS, I said that groin sores, which is HSV2, or genital herpes, whatever you want to call it, was a major probable source of infection. And that was based on a 2006 study by Washington University on HSV and HIV. That being said, we're starting to see a decline in the AIDS virus throughout Africa, probably due to the people that had HSV2 and HSV1 declining as a percentage of the population, more than homosexuality or sex itself. Another thing that's come up is, of course, hemorrhoids. They can bleed. And the thing about hemorrhoids is it affects the population between 30 and 50 the most, and then athletic people below that. Guess what? Most of the gay men that were catching HIV fell in these risk groups for hemorrhoids. So that's two sores we now have, or two types of bleeding sores. They're leading causes for the particular part of the anatomy that they belong to. Now, that being said, we also have to consider another possibility. The amount of time it takes the AIDS virus to be in the system. That's roughly averages 7 to 10 years, give or take some. It takes 7 years to 10 years for it to go from infection, dormancy, back to infection, back to full-blown AIDS, as some people like to call it. They told me that there really wasn't any such thing as full-blown AIDS. It was just simply you started having disease after disease. That's the more modern version. But the old version, there was a real situation where when they said AIDS, you could physically tell the difference. But the medicines have gotten so good now, some other disease, major disease, comes along and kills you before you really do enter the true AIDS, as far as the emasculated body and everything like that. Now, the history of HSV2 and HIV in the United States. The epidemic for HSV2 groin sores started in 1974 in the United States. 7 years later, the approximate time you would expect there to be a delay, if the HIV had anything to do with HSV2, the first person in America was diagnosed with AIDS. Think about that. It took 17 years for it to go from acute infection to dormancy back to AIDS. It takes 7 to 10 years. But within 7 years after groin sores epidemic started, we started seeing AIDS. Those match. Now, the large number of people that were taken as casualties from AIDS, about 40,000 years, about 1988, 1989, the end of the HSV2 epidemic was declared in 1994. Guess how many years that is? That's about 6 years. A little under what we want to say is the window we need But it's very close to that 7-year window. And then it sort of kind of went up a little bit in numbers, but as percentage it didn't, because the population is still increasing. Then even the percent, not only did the percent start to decline, but the aggregate number of infections and deaths started to decline. And this was about 2008 and 2010. It has been basically declining ever since. And then there's my 10S rule. The first one, the pre-play 10S check rule, basically states the following. If you have not any groin sores, then you have a low chance of catching AIDS or getting the hive infection. If you have groin sores, you have a high chance. There's references back to that University of Washington HSV2 study with the hive back in 2006, where 80 to 90% of the people with AIDS had groin sores. So it's, as an avoidance test, that's something you have to look at. If you fail that test and you do have the groin sores, then you might want to go check to see if you need PrEP treatments. Depending on how much sex you plan on having and all that other stuff. But anyway, you might want to talk to your doctor about it. Now, there's the 10S rule. I've put this out here a long time ago. Back, I think it was 2010 and 2011. It was way up back there. But anyway, my 10S rule was an avoidance rule for hive HSV2. Basically, you check your partner. In the original version, you check both your partner and you. But since you're doing the pre-play 10S check rule now, which is done as you're preparing to go out on a date, well, the 10S rule is where you check your partner now to make sure they don't have HSV / groin sores or hemorrhoids. And if you get into the drug scene, you need to also watch out for syringes and needles and stuff like that as far as sharing them. Those three items can avoid HIV, HSV, and potentially hepatitis C. Then you've got the 10 rule. This is probably the most important one. Okay, in a 10 rule, what you do is you check your partner, say you didn't check them the night before, and you want to find out whether they've got groin sores or not, or hemorrhoids. You found out they do have groin sores or hemorrhoids, or you shared needles with them the night before. Then you may want to go to the emergency room. And you ask me why? Because you have to start PEP treatments within 3 days of the day you had sex with that person or shared needles with that person, in order to be able to prevent yourself from being infected. This medicine called PEP treatment, there's a name for the medicines, you'll have to look it up and talk to your doctor or whatever. But these PEP treatments, if started within 3 days, you have to take them, but they have an 80% success rate in keeping the person from catching the AIDS virus, even if they're exposed. I'm just telling you how to identify if you've been exposed, and this should allow you to determine whether or not you need to go get PEP treatment. Then there's the PrEP rule. Okay, let's assume you did need to go get PEP treatments. The PEP treatments were successful. Then you want to watch out for development of possible groin sores on you, because of the simple fact that you indeed did have to use PEP, and assuming you didn't already have that HIV virus in you. So you would use this PrEP treatment if you develop these groin sores, or you develop hemorrhoids, or you plan to share needles, then you need to be taking PrEP treatments. Again, reference your doctor. You need to talk to your doctor about this stuff. Well, I think that pretty much covers all of it. I've covered both the history of AIDS in the United States, history of AIDS in Africa, and, hey, what can I say? One other thing I wanted to mention, though, as far as the AIDS history in Africa. In Swaziland, the one I said was the most, they dropped 43% infection rate. Also, you have to think about that country. They have a 16.7% male infection rate for HIV, AIDS. Their female infection rate is 40%. Now, if we go back to the 2003 World Health Organization Global HSV study and look at the African numbers, 55% of the men back then had groin sores and 70% of the women. You can see where that is a direct line down from what they had to what they have now. So, you can look at it the way you want to. Thomas Willis out here. Have a good day, and I hope you're having all the fun you need.